congruency between the work portfolio you put together and what those expectations are at your particular institution. And then I think it's also important to understand the complementary roles, but the distinct aspects of promotion versus tenure. We talk about those simultaneously, but they're actually two distinctly different acts that often happen simultaneously, but not always. So that's how you can explain an associate professor that's untenured, right? It's because they aren't paired together per se. So in that aspect, the function around the promotion generally has this external evaluative component where the voices of the field will review your work, provide external referee letters, and be used to determine how you fit from a promotional through the ranks aspect. And that is still the case when you go from associate to full, the promotional piece, the external voice in that process. And then the tenure component blends in and brings in certain internal dynamics and realities because that's an institutional commitment to your potential employment, possibly for the remainder of your career. So there are some other components that come into play with internal realities for the tenure aspect. And then I think it's also important to be clear about the length of clock, right? That, all institutions some institutions may have a variation on what that clock looks like based on when your materials must go up for review. So as you break this down, think about how much time you really have, right? So you have a total of 7 years to either transition from one rank to the next, assuming you didn't stop your clock for using some type of institutional policy that permits you to do that. But if you break that down, so then that means your third year review or your contract renewal, you have approximately 2.5 years worth of work, right? You don't have 3 years of work. You got less than 3 years that'll be reviewed at your third year review. Then, as you get to your dossier year, depending upon when those materials must go up, you don't have 7 years worth of total work, right? You have possibly 5 years if you must go up in the top of your 6, right? So that you hit a so that clock is not quite 7, but when you start to break that down, you might have about 4 years of work that gets considered for your tenure review, right? And so I bring that part up because as you are going into your final year, you're putting your dossier together. And oftentimes, the work that you're doing in that year is not going to count in that dossier. Your clock is lengthened or shortened as it relates to the work that goes in that portfolio is also dependent upon whether your institution accepts in-press or must be published work. That changes those dynamics as well. And so depending upon the types of journals you publish in, some of the top journals now have a 2-year window or larger once it's accepted to reach print. These are all things you want to be factoring into the process of thinking about publishing strategies, tricks, trade, but the reality that there's a clock that's in place. Once you arrive to your institution, ideally prior to that, you survey the landscape. And when you survey this landscape, you are looking to identify certain aspects that are going to be critical whether you ignore them or not. One would be, where are the gatekeepers at the various levels that you must interact with? They don't necessarily walk around with a sign on their neck that says gatekeeper, right? But they're gatekeepers. You can be cognizant of it or not, but there's someone standing at that gate going to determine if your work and you are worthy to enter through. And so it's important to know who those individuals are, particularly coming in the door. Then there's going to be power brokers and there's going to be coalitions. These things are going to be pre-existing. The question you have to ask yourself is, can you figure out where they are and understand how to navigate them, but be quite careful in doing anything that associates you with any particular type of coalition, because what that means is that there's people in that coalition and not in that coalition. So if you end up in the wrong one, you could be a casualty. And then unearth expectations. Some places might give you a written manual that lays out everything you should do. I haven't seen one of those places. But what you certainly can do through your own data collection process is unearth these expectations. Oftentimes it's better to meet with your new colleagues one-on-one, because one-on-one you are often able to get access to information you may not get in groups. You can develop some type of authentic relationship to get information transferal, and one-on-one scenarios often makes that a little easier to do if they particularly want to share something with you that's sensitive. You should be able to identify who the stars are. Look at the work that they've done. Look at their portfolios. Look at their dossiers. Understand why they're considered to be a star in that department or in that unit. You can also just figure out who's been unsuccessful. Look at those cases. Understand why that has been the case. And in most cases, particularly if you're at a public institution, these dossiers and CVs and materials are available in public for you to review. Be sure to read all the promotion and tenure policy documents yourself. Don't rely on secondhand information. Read them yourself. They probably are in a part of a packet that was given to you. Read them so that you can understand what those written expectations are. Also understand where the administrative hub that administers the promotion and tenure process. Oftentimes, that's where the centralized inventory of these dossiers are more easily available, where you can go and ask to look at the most recent successful dossiers of that particular year, so you can get a sense of how decision-making is occurring. And then seek out external perceptions, because you're going to have to get external letters, and those letters that come externally will be shaped by the perceptions on the type of work that goes on at your particular institution. And so there may be some external perceptions that don't match the internal realities, but you need to know what those are, because you will have to get these letters. And then teaching, this is an interesting dynamic, but I would strongly encourage everyone that if you have not read if you just peruse the evaluation forms that they use each semester, look at them more carefully, right? Because the amount of time sometimes placed on your scores is far more significant than you would think. And sometimes it's a matter of not recognizing that there's a set of questions asking if you deviate from your topic on a regular basis, right? You know, so look at those expectations and try to understand where that can play into your realities. It's also helpful, to the extent that you can, capture some of your own original data about the effectiveness of your teaching with your classes, particularly if the evaluation tools that are used don't capture all the work that you do very well, but also if you have some granular content that is of interest to you to be able to communicate. This is particularly helpful if you teach courses that historically get low ratings. So if you teach research courses, certain mandatory required courses, you know, there's some built-in bias responses, which basically means that you're going to have lower response rates, but it doesn't mean that your teaching is any less effective than teachers in other courses. And then research, which I'm going to come back and say a little bit more about in a moment, is very critical in most cases, particularly if you are at a research institution, in that you want to be sure that you align with the recommendations made earlier about having a long-term research agenda. But be able to articulate the voice that you're going to feel in your work and the gaps, and grounding the work that you do in appropriate and using appropriate frameworks. You know, we don't spend much time talking about the types of things that often disrupt the person's careers, but the types of frameworks that you use, methodological techniques, strategies, you know, these can be some hotly contested debates about the value of your work sometimes. And it could be just the ability to communicate why your strategy is effective versus some more traditional or preferred strategies. And then the service component, and this is important too as you think about publishing, right? So a lot of this can be disrupting realities for you to be effective at some of your publishing. But you certainly want to make service works in promotion and tenure, right? Because the reality is you can't get out of it, right? You might get some protections at certain points in your career, but at the end of the day, service is the shared responsibilities that you will have with the rest of your colleagues, right? You all don't share in your personal success, right? You don't all share in the grants that you bring in, but you do all share in the shared workload that the department or your unit carries collectively, which is often done through service, right? So in that regard, you know, if you think strategically about how to utilize this service, you can also be thinking about high impact opportunities, right? So how can you be a part of the service at the institution where it is high profile and high impact when you have a choice? How can you align the service that you participate in with the work expectations that were in your appointment letter, right? Also, these are great opportunities to learn about university values when you are in committees helping make decisions about aspects of the institution. You hear the espoused values of your colleagues. These are helpful things to know and to understand as you're becoming familiar with where the value system sits. There are also good opportunities to inform your research depending upon what these service opportunities are. And certainly take full advantage of your service as networking opportunities, because oftentimes these may be among the few times that you are outside of your small sphere, and here's a chance to maybe begin to connect with those across campus, across your school or college in meaningful ways. And how you perform in these service roles generally do predict whether you get some of the prime opportunities to do service activities. Do you make value contributions? Do you speak up? Do you add value into the dialogue? These are all very important components of interaction within and outside of your particular unit. Then institutional-based service. You know, if you know you're going to have to do service, then ask yourself, what parts of service can you shape decision-making in the culture or the resulting diversity in your space? These are some that you can actually make some immediate impact. Search and screen committees with the capability to be a part of decision-making of how diverse the pool is, who gets to come to campus. These are some prime ways to utilize service to contribute in important ways to your institution. The program committee, what courses and what expectations become valued to be in the core, not in the core. Program directions. This is a prime way to make a statement within your particular unit. Admissions, the ability to shape who gets in your department and decision making around recruitment. So if you're going to do service, you could do some service that can really, make the place a very interesting place to work at. Who gets awards? Award committees. How do you identify the alumni that gets awards? Well, oftentimes, there's not someone at the table that understands about the work that some diverse alumni are doing, may never make it into the awards pool, but you can be a part of that process. And in external-based service, these are probably pretty traditional ones that you all are familiar with, but you certainly want to be a part of the review process for proposals in your main conference. You know, that's usually the first step into taking on more significant professional service roles in your academic field. Ability to chair the program, co-chair the program, usually signals to your faculty colleagues that your work has been valued to the extent that you have been given oversight to the program and what gets on the program for your academic conference. That's pretty significant when you are able to talk about your impact on the field. Being a part of the referee process of what gets in key journals. Usually you start off as a journal reviewer, manuscript reviewer, to be considered to be on the editorial board. That's another important distinction, as well as being a part of grant review panels, particularly if you do grantsmanship or you do grant externally funded work. Being on those panels allows you to hear the discussions and the breakdown and analysis of proposals being considered so that you can strengthen your strategy of putting together your proposals going forward. And inherently, you develop a network of colleagues who are reviewers, and, you know, name recognition does play some level of consideration, particularly when these aren't blind reviews. Most grants, you know who wrote those grants for funding, and because you consider their ability and capability to do the work, right? So having a relationship where people understand the type of work that you do and the quality of it can be quite helpful. Collegiality does matter. It does matter. Whether it's clearly stated or not, it matters. Whether you define this as being a good citizen or whether you define this as them liking you, it matters. It matters because they are making long-term decisions about whether you fit in the department. And so with that being said, you don't want to just not attend key and important aspects of what the department does, right? So if there are important meetings that decisions are going to be made, make sure you go, particularly if you have a chance. So you don't want to develop certain perceived or perceptions about you that you are not a departmental contributor or departmental citizen, and to the extent that you're able to be full participant in these relevant meetings, actively be engaged in any committee service that you have been provided, you know, be a supporter of departmental events, and develop a relationship with your colleagues. You know, you don't have to go out and have drinks with them to develop a relationship. You can have, you know, some level of scheduled meetings where it's one-on-one in their office. It could be lunch, it could be coffee, where you get a chance to understand how they see and value work. I'm going to say this, and then I'll move on. Keep regular office hours. Now, and you get to decide what they are, but keep them, right? Because you got a couple things that happen. You're gonna have students are going to be looking for you, right? So if they know when they can reach you, then they won't complain that they can never find you. And then your colleagues are going to have occasions where they're going to want to meet with you and talk to you too. So if you're never around, it's hard to determine, you know, how you fit and what types of relationships that are in place. So you know, these are just some things that can help address some challenges. When you go to conferences, take full advantage of your conference, right? You can just go to your session, or you could utilize these as great networking opportunities, because this is at least one of the times in the year you got access to everyone in your area, right? So be strategic and set up meetings. Every year, meet 2 to 3 people that you want to meet you didn't know the year before, and just develop and build your network like that throughout the course of your career. Take full advantage of that. When you do conference presentations, make sure they turn into papers. Yeah, so when your CV is being looked at for promotion and tenure, one of the things we want to know is, are you converting your conference papers to publications? Because if not, then that means that you aren't presenting research. You might be just doing panel work that doesn't translate to research, right? So these are the types of questions that you want to consider. And in exhibit hall, what do you do in exhibit hall? Just roam, speak, right? The exhibit hall is actually a very good place to bounce ideas off of publishers to see where what they see is receptive for book contracts, where they see interest in the field. And so you can actually talk to these acquisition editors. Like, you don't have to just buy books. You can actually talk to the acquisition editors to get a sense of where they see current interest in areas. And you can also talk to them about the work that you're doing to get a sense and engagement around the value of the work that you are planning to do, because you might get some helpful feedback, right? Because it is a metric, and it could be a very important metric if your discipline requires you to publish books, right? So oftentimes those acquisition editors are at the big main academic conferences. And then document everything. So so that you have clarity about how productive you are, document it. At the end of each semester, develop your activity production report and document everything you did, right? So that if you're ever asked a question, well, what have you been doing this semester? You shouldn't have to struggle to do that, right? You should be able to communicate across all these spectrums what you've done. You should know what journals, articles you've been working on. You should know what data collection you have. You should know what types of advising you've done that semester. You should know what type of requests you have honored across the institution, how many hours it required for you to do that. You know, service is one of those unique things that there's an assumption that all service is the same. And it might just be one line, but unless you're able to communicate the volume of your commitment in that work, it's hard to differentiate what it means to be on the awards committee, say, versus the athletic board. I sat on the athletic board at UW for 8 years. That was at least a 20-hour-a-month commitment. It's distinctly different from doing once a semester awards committee work, right? So I made sure that it was clear to my colleagues how involved that service was, because none of them had done it. So unless you can communicate it in a way for that value to be recognizable, you don't get that type of credit. So then for the promotion and tenure structure, it has relevance to the publishing. Here, at most institutions, the primary decision happens at 1 or 3 levels. That your department or your school or your university, and the other 2 are kind of perfunctory. They either sign off on the work at the other 2 levels, or they have some kind of check off to make sure all your pieces are in the right place, right? Where that primary evaluation unit is makes all the difference in the world on your journal placement and where your priorities would go. In most cases, it's at the departmental level where the individuals that knows the field and your work most, their review and evaluation carries the most weight. If that is the case, then the capabilities of understanding the nuanced realities around a specialized journal and the fact that it has high impact ratio and it has high utility and value in the field, your department will be able to figure that out. If the evaluation happens at the school level or the university level, those capabilities are not quite the same. And so it's important to know whether your work will be viewed in the context of your discipline or a sub specialty in your discipline or some broader perspective. And just as an example, at Wisconsin, we have these divisional committees that's university-wide where our primary focus occurs, and it's 12-person committee. It may or may not have a person in social studies that is in education, and they're evaluating your work. So in that context, if you don't recognize that they're looking at you as an education scholar and they're viewing top journals as top journals in education, then you wouldn't recognize that the top journal in your field is considered a tier 2 journal. And then if you have a subfield specialty, you wouldn't know that that's a tier 3. That's not the case in a lot of places, but if you don't know that in that case, you would find yourself to be in a troubled situation when your portfolio goes forward, even if you're doing work similar to the work that you learned how to do when you were getting your graduate degree. All right, so publishing in the academy, lessons learned. So here are some lessons that I learned not only through promotion and tenure, but even now with running my research laboratory. So here's a context here. So I think the first important thing to do, especially if at all possible, and you haven't, assuming that you haven't done it, but maybe you have, develop an outlook on what your long-term research agenda is, right? Now, we all tend to use the language of research agenda, but then when you ask somebody to tell you about their research agenda, they tell you really about a research study. And that study to them is their agenda. But the question is, when you get done with that, what's next, right? So you're outlining a research study. So the question is, to the extent you're able to, in graduate programs are sometimes a good place for it. Postdocs are a good place for it sometimes. But what if you had to lay out over a 25-year period, what is your agenda? And where do you start? Right? So what's the continuum? And one of the things that's critical is depending upon your long-range agenda, you might currently be attempting to start at the wrong place if you want to learn or contribute to a subset of questions over a longer period of time. And because in general, I think everyone the document said everybody was social scientists. I mean, it's more like you are an artist painting, and each study is a stroke, right? And each stroke adds to this larger picture, because it might take 25 studies for us to really be able to say something reasonable as a collective of knowledge, that we have to understand where we're going to go with our work. So that's the first one. To the extent that you can do that, it's pretty helpful. The second would be understand your strengths and weaknesses. Not just what you do well, but what you don't do well. Right? So what don't you do well as it relates to the research and publication process? And opposed to trying to ignore those weaknesses, if this is going to be a long-term career strategy, you want to figure out how you address those weaknesses, whether that is individually or whether you understand what type of resources are available to you. Because if you think about the research and publication process and the many aspects to it, while they might say you should come out and have all those skills, you may not right away. Then one lesson I learned was early off I had to transition from doing research studies to research projects. So this is what I mean by that. So almost, unless you're doing secondary analysis, in most cases when you do data collection, the question is, are you doing the data collection to write one study, or are you doing data collection to fuel a project? And so early off, what I did is I had to transition from going through the whole data collection process, one publication, maybe two. And you know how long it takes to collect your data, you know how long it takes to analyze your data, and then when the year ends, you say, well, I'm not productive enough. But you got to go get more data then, right? So what I started to do was conceptualize everything around research projects. And then within the research project, so one of them was like the glass ceiling effects project. So we knew we wanted to look at glass ceiling effects in higher education. And then what we did is we thought long term, right? So, okay, so this might take us 7 years. So what data do we need to answer the set of questions we want to answer? And then, and within that context, we spelled out the journal articles we wanted to do, and we spelled out the books we wanted to do. And we did all of that before we collected our first piece of data, right? So then if you go back and you look at those publications that look like, okay, it was one here, one there, one there, we knew what those was going to be at the conceptualization stage. And what it did was it strategically permitted the one data collection effort to allow us to fuel a 7 to 10 type publication project opposed to just a study. And then creatively build your research team. You know, and I say creatively because maybe you have money, maybe you don't have money, but there's a lot of creative ways to get support to do your work. You know, whether it's through undergraduate research assistants, whether it's linking in certain institutionally funded programs and efforts where you can get access to support, or you actually have the ability to have research assistants, graduate assistants. But think about how you can creatively build support for the work that you want to do, and depending upon the type of work you do, the support that you will need will look different. And so that is, I think that's a long-term important type strategy if you think about the assistance and ability to do work, because at some point you start thinking about your production and the work you need to do. If you're doing every part of it, including going and retrieving certain documents from the library and other places, you know, it just will slow you down a little bit more. When your financial advisor would tell you that when you get your check, the first thing you should do is you should pay yourself. Anybody heard that before? Pay yourself first? Well, you got to pay yourself first with research. Right? So, you know, when you structure your day, make sure you put in your time toward whatever project you're working on or you plan to work on. So pay yourself first before you start going and doing all the service and all the other things that's on your agenda. Figure out how you pay yourself first on that day to work toward your publication. The other dynamic I had to deal with too, moving from research studies to projects, was I had to get on a 3-year cycle. Now this might expand a little bit depending on the type of work that you were doing, but here's the thing: if you don't know what you're working on next year, it's hard to write conference proposals. It's hard to put in for grants, right? So if you're writing grants for something you're working on right now, what are you going to do? Stop working on it? Or delay the work? So if you if you just think about the cycles of the academy, you kind of need to know what you're doing next year in order to have those proposals ready for those conferences, to be able to compete for grants, you got to know what you're going to be doing. So unless you have like this, what I call a 3-year cycle, you don't know what you're doing next year. You just know what you're doing right now. So if you're in, so I say 3-year cycle, but it might be, you might put 2 years between each of these. But the point here is that in every year, you should be at one point of this 3-part cycle. You should be conceptualizing what you're going to do, right? And then you should be implementing what you already conceptualized. And then you should be disseminating what you've implemented all the time, so that you do know what you're going to be working on so you can write grants. You are actually writing or collecting data that you wrote the grants for or you wrote the conference papers for, and then you're actually writing those up, and then you also disseminate those to your journal articles or book chapters. And so unless you have something like that going on, there's a lot of opportunities you miss out on, because again, if a grant comes up and you write for something you're working on right now, you either have to delay it or come up with something something different enough that it could be compelling. And so for me, early off, I recognized that I didn't have the system in place to know what I was going to be doing in the future to be able to write for something that was forward thinking. And then external funding makes life easier, but the question you have to ask yourself in the type of work that you do, whether your work is funded or unfunded research, right? And so some academics can live their whole lives in an unfunded research world because they carry out topics that they come up with, and then they largely do this work by themselves, and at the same time, they aren't required to have external funding, right? And then the reverse is you have individuals that have a robust set of resources available to them that is purely externally funded and driven, and they have staff and they have all these other things that goes with it. I bring this point up just to say, if you haven't thought about what role external funding should or should not play in your research, it's something you should at least begin to think about, because it is a different world, right? Yes, the publications come out and they look the same, but there's a lot of things that are available to those with external funds than if you don't. And maybe that plays a role in how you frame your work. Maybe you'll get a grant every 5 to 7 years. Maybe your whole career would be built on external funding. But however it plays in your career, it's worth thinking about now so that you can, if you don't have the skills or have the networking in place, that you can begin to develop what that looks like going forward for you. The other thing I had to do early off was come up with a project management system. And so because I wanted to be able to manage my projects in such a way where I knew when each started, when each ended, and what subsequently needed to be done, and then I could message that to my whole staff. So early off when I started in 16 years ago, it was a Gantt chart. I used a Gantt chart out of business that takes projects and pretty much charts, the project and the process along the way. At that point, it was a large sheet of paper on the wall that staff could look at. They could see when we started, what needed to be done on which days, and now we use a digital platform which sends messages. So I could message you right now and say, you don't appear to be on time, right? Because with technology, there's a lot of nice things you can do. You can even have it to where at the end of the week, they have to upload the status report, right? Because think about this. What is one of the biggest challenges about some of this work? You don't know it's going to be late till it's late. Think about it. You have somebody working on X. Unless you're all in there looking, you don't know X is not on task until the day of delivery comes and it's not there, right? But, with certain types of monitoring tools, you can, because they have to upload, and you can say, okay, you're 75% off task. So we have an online project management system tool. And then time management, I think, is key, too. Because the work that we do, you really don't have someone watching you every day. Unless you have the discipline to manage your time effectively, it can easily get away from you, right? I mean, summers where you have all this stuff outlined you're going to plan to do, it can easily, the draw of the nice sun and all these other things, it could easily, diminish your production. And these wonderful sabbaticals, which I'm on my second one. My first one, I was here at NCID. You could be productive, or you can just be on sabbatical. Because unless you have the time management and the discipline, it's at the end of the year when you turn in that annual productivity report, that's when everybody knows what you actually have done. Schedule writing. Schedule it in your day or your week, however you function. Don't leave it to happenstance if it's this important. Let's think about that. If you know today your primary evaluation criterion for you to keep the job you have or to get one better than you think you have is your publication, why leave when you write to serendipity? Like, if everybody knows that today, do you know when you write? And no one in this room, because you wouldn't be here, right? But there's a lot of scholars out here. They're leaving something so important to chance. And it's not scheduled. It's not on the calendar. They'll get to it when they can. And then, I think this is my last point, nest publishing strategies. Okay? This, I think, resonates a bit with the talk earlier, nesting publishing strategies. One of the things I had to understand early was every publication that I do is not necessarily for tenure. And the reason I say it that way is, in many cases, there's a narrowly defined set of things that you do that's valued in the tenure process, right? And the one that is a surefire golden egg is, unless you're in the field that values books, single-authored, top-tier journal article. Right? You're not going to get a debate on that. No one is going to say a single-authored article in a top-tier journal is not valued. It's when you add variations is when it becomes debatable. Are you the first author? Who are you authoring with? What is the meaning and understanding of this journal? But the one sure one, single authored top tier journal in your field is not debatable, right? But the work that you do might reach some audiences in other spaces, right? And you may take on that work, but you got to recognize that it doesn't mean the same thing. So for me, when I was going through promotion and tenure, I had to pay myself type of strategy. And so there were some book chapters I actually wanted to do. They were a part of projects that I thought were valuable. But I knew in order for me, so I had this system that if I wanted to be a part of that book, I got to get 4 journal articles done that semester. So if I want to be in that book, I gotta get the 4. Without the 4, I can't be in the book. And the incentive to be able to do the work I might really want to do, I need to get those 4 journal articles done, ready, and out the door. And for me, that was kind of the way that I bounced it off. But then I understood, and I had to communicate, to my committee. I said, I realized that this might not mean the same. But I said, but this is meaningful to the field. It's not meaningful to this promotion and tenure process. But if you read this work, it actually has some meaning to the field. So one of the ways that we found a happy medium was that I started writing, like if you go pull like the journal articles past 2000, the book chapters past 2002, they all got original data in them. Right, so it has original data because one of the challenges against book chapters, it does not introduce new data. Say, well, this one does. And so we were able to kind of come to a point where it was a median, but do recognize that you want to nest your strategies because there may be some things you want to do that may not be valued in the promotion tenure process. And one way to deal with that is to nest it in a way that you are ensuring that you're getting the products out and available that will be valued in your system. I'll close there. I think I actually am pretty close to, I did less than an hour. Should I take questions or not? What's, so I'm gonna give you 2 strategies. The first one is you want to go early and often, right? So if if the window may be 2 years, then when you have the most leverage or flexibility in time is earlier in the clock, right? So your strategy should certainly probably always include sending your manuscripts to the top tier journals first. And hopefully that they'll get a revise and resubmit, and then you are able to manage that process. Now, this might not help you, but it may help your students. The only way to extend your tenure clock is to publish as a graduate student, right? So you can actually go into the tenure track and have 4 or 5 pieces in the pipeline, right? So so students that have been pretty well mentored and they come in and that first year they hit 2 or 3 in the top journal, that's not by accident. Somebody prepped that up and helped them with that. Yes.
Thank you for this publication talking. It's a really nice idea. So I have one question. So does the single author publication matter in the promotion process? Because now I have a problem. I have a publication, but most of it is my single author. And in my area, I cannot find the same the research interest in my department. So I just directed to publishing by myself, really easy. I just wonder the single author publication. If I that in the promotion process, does it that matter? Or not?
Does it matter?
Yep.
So look at it this way. If you a single author, I know you did everything, or at least I think you do it. You did everything. You add authors. Now I need to figure out. So who idea is this? Who did what part? Which author are you in the line, right? So if all your work was single authored pieces, we're going to attribute their whole body of work to you. If it's not, then we have to determine how much of this is your intellectual leadership and how much of the work that you've done. So I think there are some advantages that you have for that artifact. Now, if you're asking a question, could your work be better if you had other colleagues a part of your team in reading? I mean, that is a perspective that is out there, but but if you're looking at a portfolio and it's all single authored, everything's attributed to you. So how good it is or how bad it is, it's all attributed to you.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So does it matter for the issue of the collegiality? Because I only do myself, but sometimes that I have one experience. I went to an interview for the other university, and the interviewer asked me, "Oh, why your publication all did by yourself? Why didn't you co-author with the other?" So I find that.
So there may be some institutional preferences, right? But in general, when people say top tier single journal article, I mean, that's still the corner of the realm. You may be in a context where they prefer you work with collaborators. If that's the case, then you work on that. Usually what happens is you look at your portfolio and say, you need a few more single author pieces. We usually say exactly what you're saying you have.
My question has to do with just some guidance that you may be able to provide in terms of honing the one's research agenda, even back from graduate school. How do you begin to further hone that agenda for long-term productivity, personal fulfillment, disciplinary contributions? I'm at a teaching institution right now, and while I hover kind of on a broad area, sometimes I'm still just really trying to find that strong, sharp focus.
Yeah. Well, it's not simple, right? The process of identifying a research agenda that fills a clear gap and has usefulness to the field of practice and research. And then I always throw this other metric in there. Is it compelling enough for somebody to give you money, right? That's kind of the last piece is in my world is this a compelling enough argument for me to pay you to do it? I mean, that's not simple. I mean, but it's something I could certainly, because it's not going to be the same for everyone, but it's something I could certainly talk with you individually about if you like.
Especially at my stage in my career. But you said something interesting about how promotion and tenure is decoupled. And you said that promotion is on external dynamics, tenure internal. Where I'm at, I thought it was the other way around, that tenure is really based on external letter writers, and it's really external, whereas promotion is more internal. So I was wondering if you could just speak and clarify a little bit more, because my understanding was it was the other way around.
So what I said was that promotion has an external component to it, and tenure has an internal. They're usually conjoined, but what I mean by that though is, in your tenure is kind of associated with a long-term appointment. That was the internal piece I was referencing. Both cases require you to usually have an external evaluation component to it.